Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. They just announced a bunch of healer tuning with some pretty big ramifications, I think, for Raid and for Mythic Plus. Starting off, they made some big changes to Paladin, where they fixed an issue where Hammer and Anvil was not being activated by Judgment. This was super noticeable throughout a lot of M Plus testing, in fact, and following up with it, they buffed the healing of Holy Shock, Holy Prism, Word of Glory, and Light of Dawn by 12% each. This is not only just an overall Paladin buff, but it felt really good whenever I was playing with Lightsmith in a couple dungeons. Pally in general just feels a little bit better throughout some of the keys that I was doing right after the tuning came out. And while that's nice, I think there's still a little bit more of a gap for like raw output from like the overachievers that I see right now, especially like Resto Druid, Resto Shaman being super high output healers, and Paladin still kind of being in this mode where their output is like adequate. So we're kind of getting dragged out of like the very bad tier for Paladin and into like still middle of the pack, like pretty solid output with it. Lightsmith felt a little bit better with some of those changes for Hammer and Anvil actually working. But compared to where Lightsmith was like dominant in that mid patch of like season 1 where everyone started re-rolling to it, I still think we're kind of far from that point right now. But I think this does put Paladin in like a better position instead of like the dregs that we had seen it previously. I think in order to see Pally in like Race to World first, the healing buffs would have to continue, or they'd have to have some pretty significant like damage contribution in addition to doing competitive healing against Mistweaver or something like that, because Mistweaver got a 5% healing nerf just kind of across the board. Earlier this week, or I guess it was late last week, they had some tuning to nerf Chi Harmony from 50% to 25%, and then they buffed up Vivify's direct healing. And so with all of this in mind, it's honestly kind of like a slight knock to Mistweaver in a raid, but they're still super, super good for the raid. And in keys, it kind of keeps them similar to a tier of Paladin where they're kind of like middle of the pack. They do pretty good healing. I was doing a lot of testing today, and like Jade Empowerment, with all the times they've had to nerf it, is just kind of solid, but not incredibly powerful. And so I think you still have like an easy time healing trash, but when you get to some of like the bigger heal check bosses as Monk, I don't think you have quite the advantages that a lot of other healers in like the S tier do right now. The ones I talked about in my latest M Plus tier list were like Shaman, Druid, and of course Disc Priest. But Disc Priest also got a nerf as well. Wheel and Woe, which is whenever you're casting your penance, the penance bolts will amp up either your shield or your smite. Well, they've nerfed this multiple times. It used to be 10%, if you can believe it, at the start of the expansion. Then it went down to 5%, and now they're nerfing the absorb of Wheel and Woe again from 5% to 3%. So when you cast a regular penance, you're going to be getting 3% extra shielding a stack. With 7 stacks, that means 21% extra shielding after every penance. And they also nerfed Preventative Measures, which is the Oracle hero talent that increases the absorb of your Power Word Shield. That goes from 40% to 30%. So what does this actually mean? Well, I sat there hitting some dummies, and I was putting shields for people reliably on other players for about 25 to 30% of their HP with Power Word Shields after I penance. Now, if I cast it on myself, I have the Prophet's Will buff, which is a flat, I think it's what, 30% buff? Yeah. Your self shields are still stronger. They're 30% stronger on you. Non-crit shields that I put out on other players were around 25%, and then a crit on them is going to be, closer to 50, 55%. On myself, since you have the 30% amp, I got as high as like 70, 75% of a shield when it crits, and I had all like the buffs and modifiers going on. So is it the death of Disc? I'm not fully convinced. There's some other changes I'll talk about in just a second here. The absorbs are so powerful, not only because, you get to mitigate incoming damage, helps you with burst, it also helps you store healing before damage actually happens. And a lot of those principles still come into play, and it's not super surprising to see them start trying to do something to sort of rein it in, even though it feels super last minute with almost like a month or so of PTR in the books already. It would be great to have earlier testing for it. Some of my concerns are the potential like output that you're going to have over sustained encounters, something like Swamp Face, how well you're going to deal with those. I'd be really interested in seeing if they're going to look to buff maybe like penance healing or just atonement in general to help kind of bridge the gap. Because at the moment in a raid environment, Disc is still getting bodied by Preservation. They had a change earlier this week where their tier set Essence Bomb got cut in half, which was already doing 90% overhealing. But they also fixed a bunch of buffs to Flame Shaper, where Consume Flame wasn't doing as much healing as it ought to. So Flame Shaper Preservation still nuts in raid, and since it operates in a similar niche as Disc, it's currently bodying them in raid. In keys, I think it's still going to be good, especially for dungeons like Priory, which have really high burst damage and really high like bleeds, single target damage, things along those lines. But another change that they made throughout this week was nerfing the Voidweaver tier set bonus, and now they've buffed the Entropic Rift damage for Voidweaver by 30%. And this is something I've been thinking about for a while throughout M+ testing on PTR, but I really think that you could get away with playing Voidweaver in high keys as the optimal strategy in Dawnbreaker and Arakara. Maybe some others, but I think those are the top two right now. Both those dungeons feature almost entirely burst damage. You know, Arakara has like the second boss and everything, or kind of jumps around to different people, but I think that isn't too insanely difficult of a fight to go without the single target healing of Oracle. The damage out of Voidweaver is huge. The 30% buff to the Rift damage is going to mean it's nuts for a lot of high trash density dungeons like Arakara and Dawnbreaker. So the Voidweaver tier set did make a massive power gain, and so it is nice to take some power out of the tier set, put it into like the baseline effect and everything. So that's going to be nice, but I'd be kind of curious to think at the potential for Voidweaver. Actually, it'd be really ironic if Disc was playing like half Voidweaver, half Oracle, and was like still meta as a result. I'm a little curious about how the output's going to go for Oracle in some of the higher level dungeons, but we're getting more stats, we're getting more gear, we're getting more power. Historically, Disc has had many years where it's gotten nerfed right before a tier, it gets some gear, it gets up to, you know, heroic mythic level, and then it starts bodying people. So we'll see. I don't think Disc is just dead and put a fork in it or something along those lines just yet. The change I didn't mention is they have reverted part of the mana cost nerfs that Disc received going into 11.2. Radiant's mana cost is now only increased by 10% instead of the 20%, and Renew's mana cost was reduced by 30%. This is a lot of what I was talking about in our like 11.2 review of like Holy and Disc and the revamps they did. The mana cost increases were really just bad. Nobody's having a great time when you have to drink constantly in keys, and most of these changes were more targeted at raid, where it felt like Disc had almost like infinite mana all the time. And as a result, I think the big thing with this change is that you're going to actually be able to set up your healing with mini ramps. Renew's mana cost should be pretty low so that you can actually afford to put out those atonements, because unlike in previous expansions, like BFA as an example, where your healing was gated by how many atonements you could put out, you're not really gated by how many atonements you can put out, but how much output you can have in your cooldowns, your Shadow Fiend, your Insight, your Penance Bolts, things like that. If you just hit a regular no buff Penance or something for atonement healing in raids, you're not going to do that much output. You have so many modifiers you have to set up first. So it doesn't really make sense for Disc to have to spend crazy amounts of mana the way they were in raid testing just to set up their healing. So at the moment, I think in general, Disc is still in a powerful position, and I think there's actually good options on how you can play it in a key environment. Disc is underpowered compared to Preservation, which is really overpowered in raids. Mistweaver is still really strong in raids, and I think that you're going to see them in Race to World first despite this nerf, but they're also middle of the pack for keys. So kind of similar to Disc, where these changes aren't quite moving them and jumping them from those positions that they already were. Paladin, the same thing. This feels like kind of a nice solid buff that puts them in a better feeling position, but I don't think it's going to push them into Race to World first. I don't think it's going to push them into like the high key meta or anything along those lines. It kind of just makes people feel a little bit better than where they were before. So that's my thoughts so far. I'll have a link to changes in the description down below. Like and subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I'll catch you all next time.